Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to the ideas that shape us. You've sent in your sources, and, well, we've plunged right into them to bring you the essentials.
And today, we're looking at Søren Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death.
Yeah, published way back in 1849, but honestly, it still feels incredibly relevant.
It really does. A truly significant piece written under the pseudonym Anticlimacus. And you provided some really fascinating material around this cornerstone of Christian existentialism.
Right, and the main idea, it's a bit counterintuitive at first, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kierkegaard, well, Anticlimacus, says the real sickness unto death isn't, physical death.
No, not what we normally think of.
It's something deeper, despair.
Right.
He even takes that famous line from John's Gospel, "This sickness is not unto death," about Lazarus, and flips it. For Kierkegaard, the real danger wasn't just the physical illness, it was a kind of spiritual despair. So the core idea is that our spiritual state, not just our body, is what's truly at risk.
Exactly. I mean, physical death, in a Christian view, is often seen more as a transition,
Right.
But despair, the way Kierkegaard unpacks it, it's like a spiritual death. A constant state of dying, but never actually reaching death, if that makes sense. It affects the very core of who we are, our spirit.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then.
Yeah.
To really get into this dense but pretty profound analysis of despair, we'll look at how Kierkegaard sees the self.
Yeah, that's crucial.
How despair even starts, the different, sometimes surprising ways it shows up, and then, what he thinks the solution is.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's start there. How does Kierkegaard even begin to define this thing called the self? It seems key.
It absolutely is key. And his definition, well, it's intricate, but it underpins everything. He says the self isn't a thing, it's a relation.
A relation?
Yeah. His words are something like, the self is a relation which relates itself to its own self.
Nah.
So the main point is, our being isn't static. It's this constant process of self-awareness, self-reflection. That act of relating to ourselves is what he calls spirit.
So it's not just being a collection of memories, traits. It's the awareness of that collection, the reflecting on it. That's the self.
Precisely.
And he talks about the self having tension, right? Like it's made of opposites.
Exactly. He sees us as a synthesis, a bringing together of these fundamental opposites. Infinite and finite, temporal and eternal, freedom and necessity. We're constantly juggling these tensions. Think about, our big dreams versus our real world limits, or the present moment versus wanting something lasting.
But just being that mix of opposites doesn't automatically make you a self, does it? There's another step.
Right. Kierkegaard is very clear here. Just being the synthesis, this mix, isn't enough. The self really emerges only when this underlying relation, this blend of opposites, actively relates to itself.
Oh, okay.
It's when we become conscious of this internal tug of war and sort of take ownership of being this particular combination.
Okay, and here's where it gets, I think, really crucial. This self relating to itself. It doesn't just pop out of nowhere, right? He says it comes from somewhere else.
Absolutely. This is fundamental for him. He calls the self a derived, constituted relation. And this relation is posited, set up, established by another.
And that other is?
For Kierkegaard, it's God. No ambiguity there. Our very existence, our selfhood, is grounded in, dependent on this divine source. He argues that real, stable selfhood requires consciously acknowledging that dependence.
Okay. So if the self is this relation relating to itself, grounded in God, then despair must be what happens when that goes wrong somehow, when the relating part messes up.
Exactly. Despair, the sickness unto death, comes from what he calls a misrelation. And this can happen in basically two main ways.
Okay.
Either there's an imbalance within the synthesis itself, like we lean too heavily on the finite and ignore the infinite, or the other way around. Or, more fundamentally, it's a flawed relationship between ourself and the God who established it in the first place.
But it's not the synthesis itself that's the problem, is it? It's not like being made of opposites is inherently bad.
That's a really important distinction, yeah. The despair isn't inherent in the structure. It's the failure to relate properly, failure to balance the internal parts, or failure to relate rightly to God. It comes from us.
So it's our fault, in a sense.
He definitely puts the responsibility on the individual. He says despairing lies in man himself. It's not just some psychological condition that happens to us. It's an ethical, a spiritual failure.
What about when people say they're despairing over something? Like losing a job or a relationship ending. How does that fit?
Well, Kierkegaard sees that a bit differently. Sure, external things can make us sad, trigger loss, but he argues the real underlying despair is always, always about the self.
Always.
Yeah. So if someone despairs because they didn't become, say, Caesar, his example, it's not just about missing the power or fame. It's deeper. It's an inability to accept their actual self in light of that failure. They cannot bear to be himself in that situation, you know?
Ah, I see. So it's a rejection of who they are right now because it doesn't match who they wanted to be or maybe who they think God intended.
Exactly. Or a fundamental refusal to accept the self as it is, constituted by God.
Wow. Okay, so this definition, relational, dependent on God, has huge implications. If you're not properly grounded in God, you're already in a state of misrelation. That state is despair.
Precisely. It's not just a mood. It's an ontological condition about the very nature of our being. Being spiritually well, not being in despair, means being grounded transparently in the power which posited it. If the self is cut off from its source, it's inherently sick.
Okay, that's a really solid foundation. Now, this sickness, despair, it isn't just one thing. Kierkegaard goes into incredible detail about the different forms it takes.
He does. His taxonomy, his categorization is quite remarkable. It's phenomenological based on how despair appears in experience.
And the key difference between the forms is awareness.
Yes.
Consciousness.
Yes, exactly. The level of consciousness, awareness of being in despair, awareness of having this eternal self grounded in God, that's the crucial factor. And here's the paradox. The more conscious you are of your despair, the more intense the suffering. Yeah. But that heightened awareness is also what makes overcoming it more possible. The least conscious forms are actually the most stuck, the hardest to cure.
Right. Let's start with the least conscious one then. He calls it unconscious despair, which sounds contradictory.
It does. That's why he also calls it despair improperly so-called, or the despair of ignorance. This is someone who's in despair but has absolutely no idea.
How is that possible?
Because they're fundamentally unaware they even have a true eternal self grounded in God. They live entirely in the finite world, oblivious to the spiritual dimension.
So what does that look like in everyday life? Someone just happy, successful?
Often, yeah. It can look like contentment, worldly success. They might be totally absorbed in their job, social life, possessions. Their choices are guided by what feels good or bad. That's the sensualist.
Okay.
Or they just go along with the crowd, social norms. That's the Philistines or the mass man. Kierkegaard has this great analogy. Imagine a house with many floors. The person in unconscious despair lives only in the basement, totally unaware, or maybe just uninterested, in the upper floors representing the spirit.
So someone can seem totally fine, even thriving by worldly standards, but be spiritually empty without knowing it. That sounds, well, he calls it most dangerous.
Exactly. Because it's hidden. If you don't know you're sick, you won't look for a cure, right? He sees it as spiritlessness, a failure to become who you truly are as a spiritual being. It makes any kind of awakening really difficult.
Okay. So moving up the ladder of awareness, we get to conscious despair. Yeah. Here, there's at least some inkling that something's wrong.
Yes. And this category splits further. First, there's the despair of weakness.
Despair of weakness. What does that mean?
This is where someone knows they have a self, but they lack the will to truly affirm it, especially when facing suffering or relating to the eternal. They sort of wish they could escape being themselves, or they try to define themselves only by earthly things.
So they know they exist, but they don't really want to, or can't handle it.
Something like that. They might try to flee from the responsibility of being a self. It really resonates with Sartre's idea of bad faith, trying to dodge the burden of freedom.
And what does this weakness look like? How does it manifest?
Often triggered by external stuff, setbacks, disappointments. The person who dreams big fails and then despairs over their whole being, feeling inadequate. They cannot bear to be himself in failure.
Okay.
It can also look like despair over earthly things just being temporary, or blaming everything external fatalism, just giving up. Internally, it might be despairing over feeling small and weak compared to the eternal, leading to cynicism. Kierkegaard even links it to secret suffering, and sometimes thinking about suicide as an escape.
Wow. That's heavy. Okay, so that's weakness. What's the other type of conscious despair?
The despair of defiance. This is much more active, maybe even aggressive.
Defiance. Against what?
Against God, ultimately. This is the most intense, most conscious form. The person is fully aware of their despair, fully aware of their self, but they defiantly assert their own self-sufficiency. They reject any dependence on God. They will to be themselves, but in opposition to the divine power that established them.
So it's not just weakness or running away, it's an active rebellion. Like, I'll do it my way even if it destroys me.
Exactly. You might see someone clinging to their suffering, almost proud of it, like it's a badge of honor or proof the world or God is wrong. They might refuse help, even divine help, feeling like it's too late. We're just wanting to rage against existence.
A kind of perverse pride in misery.
Yeah, there's an element of that. It has echoes of Nietzsche's resentment, maybe. Kierkegaard himself calls it demoniac madness. It's pretty extreme.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, so we have unconscious despair and then conscious despair split into weakness and defiance. You also mentioned he analyzes despair based on those synthesis parts, finite, infinite, possibility, necessity.
Yes, he offers another way to slice it, looking at imbalances in those core components of the self.
So what happens if the infinite side gets out of whack? Too much imagination, maybe.
That's the despair of infinitude. The self loses its footing in reality, gets lost in abstract possibilities, wild imagination, detached theories. There's no grounding in the finite, concrete world, like the philosopher building grand systems but totally disconnected from life.
Okay, I can picture that. And the opposite. Too much focus on the finite.
That's the despair of finitude. The self gets totally swallowed up by worldly concerns. Practicalities, the mundane. It leads to that spiritlessness, again, a narrow, cramped existence that ignores the eternal dimension, the self's potential for more.
Right. What about possibility and necessity? How does despair show up there?
Well, the despair of possibility is when someone is like drunk on potential. So many options, so many possible selves, they never actually commit to anything. Nothing becomes real. It all stays potential.
Analysis paralysis, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And conversely, the despair of necessity is feeling crushed by circumstances. Fate, determinism, losing all sense of freedom or hope that things could be different. This is the despair of the fatalist, or maybe the complacent person who just accepts everything passively.
It's amazing how many different shades of despair he identifies. They all seem linked, though. Different faces of the same core problem.
They really are. Different ways that fundamental misrelation can manifest.
And you said before, getting better means moving through these more conscious, more painful forms.
That's the paradox. Unconscious despair feels okay, maybe, but it's the furthest from a cure because there's no awareness of the need for a cure.
Right.
Even defiant despair, which sounds terrible, is paradoxically closer to the possibility of faith just because the person is so acutely aware of their self and the eternal, even if they're fighting it. The key isn't escaping the sickness, it's confronting it, understanding it.
Okay, so if despair is the sickness, what's the cure? What's the antidote Kierkegaard offers?
The antidote, the direct opposite, and the cure for despair is faith. Tro, in Danish.
Faith, not just belief, though.
No, much more than that. He sees faith as the opposite of despair, especially despair in its most conscious form, which he identifies as sin choosing to stay in despair when you know about God.
And he has that specific formula for spiritual health, right?
It does. Anti-Climacus puts it like this. In relating itself to itself, and in willing to be itself, the self rests transparently in the power that established it.
Rests transparently. What does that mean exactly?
It means a completely open, conscious, trusting, accepting relationship with God, recognized as the source and ground of your being. No hiding, no defiance, no trying to be self-sufficient.
So faith isn't just ticking a belief box. It's a whole way of being. A reorientation of the self.
Exactly. It's successfully integrating all those clashing elements, finite, infinite, temporal, eternal, possibility, necessity, by getting that relationship with God right, acknowledging your dependence. And for Kierkegaard, this faith involves passion, commitment, trust. It requires that famous leap going beyond pure reason. It's about being willing to be yourself, the unique individual you are before God, accepting responsibility, finding meaning, even in suffering.
And where does Christianity fit into this specifically? Why is it so central for him?
Well, he sees Christianity as the specific revelation that shows us, first, the true nature of the self as spirit, second, the true nature of despair as sin, this misrelation before God, and third, it offers the cure, the possibility of a direct relationship with God through Christ.
So Christianity provides the framework and the means to achieve this state of faith.
That's how he sees it. It reveals the problem and the solution. And once that revelation is out there, choosing to stay in despair isn't just an unfortunate state anymore. It becomes sin, a refusal of the cure.
So faith isn't just changing your mind. It's like fixing the structure of your being, an ontological realignment.
Precisely. Despair is an ontological misrelation, a structural flaw when you're not oriented correctly towards foe. Faith is the realignment. By consciously acknowledging dependence, willing to be yourself grounded in God, You correct that flaw. It changes your whole mode of existence from alienation to groundedness, authenticity.
Now, to really get why he was so intense about this, it helps to know what's going on around him,
Yeah.
right? The context in Denmark.
Absolutely. Mid-19th century Denmark was a time of huge change. You had the 1848 revolution shaking things up politically, ending absolute monarchy, changes in the state church.
And porcelain for him, too.
Yeah, he was grappling with his own past the broken engagement, public ridicule, and figuring out his writing direction after supposedly ending his pseudonymous work. A lot was in flux.
And intellectually, the big thing was Hegel, right? German idealism.
Very much so. Hegel's philosophy, his system, was hugely influential, and Kierkegaard had a strong reaction against it.
What was his main issue with Hegel?
He felt Hegel's big, abstract system completely overlooked the individual, the single, unique, subjective person. For Kierkegaard, truth wasn't about objective speculation. It was about inwardness, passion, personal commitment. He thought Hegel dissolved real individual lives into impersonal processes.
So a total rejection.
Well, it's complex. Some scholars argue he was engaging deeply with Hegel, maybe critiquing Danish Hegelians more than Hegel himself. Even that dense definition of the self we started with, you could see it as playing with or maybe mocking the Hegelian style.
Interesting. And he was also critical of the church at the time.
Oh, definitely. He railed against Christendom, the established Danish state church. He saw it as complacent, bourgeois, hypocritical, lacking real passionate faith, just a comfortable social institution.
So the sickness unto death is partly aimed at them, at nominal Christians.
You can definitely read it that way, as a diagnosis of the spiritual emptiness hiding within that comfortable Christian society, a challenge to their self-satisfaction.
So the book was really a passionate pushback against things he saw threatening authentic individual existence, both big philosophical systems and lukewarm religion.
Exactly. A defense of subjectivity, freedom, and a deeply personal faith against forces that he felt diminished the individual's relationship with God.
And this reaction, born out of that specific time and place, ended up having this massive ripple effect on later thinkers, didn't it? Even those outside of Christianity. It's seen as foundational for existentialism.
Absolutely. Kierkegaard is widely called the father of existentialism, even though he never used the term himself. The sickness unto death, especially, lays out so many core existentialist themes long before the movement really took shape.
Like what specifically? What makes it so central for existentialism?
Well, first, that intense focus on subjectivity, inwardness, the personal experience, that's huge. Second, the emphasis on radical freedom and the anxiety and responsibility that come with it. Then there's the whole idea of authenticity versus inauthenticity despair being a prime example of inauthentic existence. His analysis of effects like anxiety and despair as fundamental parts of being human, not just emotions.
Right.
And even that famous existentialist idea, existence precedes essence. The idea that we become who we are through choices. We aren't born with a fixed nature. You can see the roots of that in Kierkegaard's dynamic view of the self.
And within Christian thought itself, its impact there.
Equally profound. It's a key text for Christian existentialism, obviously. It offers this powerful theological anthropology understanding human nature where the self is grounded in God, sin is despair before God, and true selfhood comes through grace and faith.
Challenging traditional views.
Yeah, and challenging overly rational approaches to theology, emphasizing the limits of reason in grasping God, the need for personal commitment. And that focus on the individual's direct relationship with God really resonated with critics of empty institutional religion.
It's fascinating how it works on both levels. It's deeply Christian, yet the diagnosis of the human condition, the anxiety, the despair, speaks to non-religious people too.
That's absolutely right. You could almost say secular existentialism took Kierkegaard's diagnosis of the sickness,
Right.
the anxiety, the search for meaning, the despair, but then rejected his cure, offering humanistic solutions instead of the leap of faith.
So, given this huge influence later on, how was it actually received when it first came out?
Not great initially. Back in Denmark, the reception was pretty limited, often negative. He was controversial, and maybe people just didn't get the depth of it at the time. It really took off in the early 20th century with translations. That's when his ideas started to spread and influence thinkers internationally.
And the list of people influenced is pretty staggering. Philosophers, theologians.
Psychologists, writers, yeah.
Yeah.
In philosophy, you've got Martin Heidegger, who acknowledged Kierkegaard was essential for his own work, Being and Time,
Right.
though he critiqued Kierkegaard for staying too ontologic, not ontological enough for him. him.
Right.
Jean-Paul Sartre, obviously huge in existentialism, drew heavily on the ideas of freedom, responsibility, self-creation, but being an atheist, he parted ways on God. Albert Camus admired the diagnosis of the absurd but rejected the leap of faith, advocating revolt instead.
And others.
Jaspers, Wittgenstein, even Kafka. You can see traces of Kierkegaard's influence in so many different places.
And in theology. You mentioned Barth and Tillich.
Yes. Karl Barth, hugely influential theologian, initially saw Kierkegaard as a wake-up call from liberal theology, using concepts like the infinite qualitative distinction. Later, he grew more critical of the subjectivity. Paul Tillich integrated themes like anxiety and non-being into his own system, the method of correlation, but again with different conclusions.
And others too.
Yeah, theologians like Bultmann and Bonhoeffer also engaged with his ideas on sin, subjective faith, and the critique of cheap grace or cultural Christianity.
And it even reached into psychology.
It did. Rollo May, a key figure in existential psychology, really leaned on Kierkegaard for understanding anxiety not just as neurosis, but as ontological part of being human, facing freedom and death. He found the distinction between depression and the deeper condition of despair very useful.
And literature, too. You mentioned Walker Percy.
Yes, Percy explicitly cited Kierkegaard as a major influence. His novels, like The Moviegoer, grapple directly with Kierkegaardian themes. Alienation, despair, what Percy called spiritual suicide, the search for meaning, faith in the modern world. It's very direct.
So it sounds like people are still wrestling with Kierkegaard, interpreting him in different ways.
Oh, absolutely. It's ongoing. His writing is dense. He uses pseudonyms, irony, dialectic. It's challenging. Even his relationship with Hegel is still debated.
So the difficulty is part of the point, maybe.
I think so. The fact that thinkers across the spectrum, theists, atheists, philosophers, theologians, psychologists, find something to grapple with speaks to the power of his work. The ambiguity and difficulty force you to engage personally, actively. It's not passive reading.
So at the end of the day, the sickness unto death really holds up. It's this powerful diagnosis of a core spiritual problem being disconnected, imbalanced, fundamentally in despair.
Exactly. Philosophically, its significance lies in that shift to subjectivity, exploring existential feelings, challenging systems. Theologically, it's this radical view of human nature, a critique of superficial religion, a call for passionate individual commitment.
And beyond the specifics of philosophy or theology, its legacy is just this profound exploration of being human, right? The anxiety, the alienation, the search for meaning that people still feel so strongly.
It really is a masterful and still incredibly timely look at that spiritual abyss we can fall into and the path, challenging as it is, towards an authentic life grounded in faith.
So as you've taken this deep dive with us, here's something to maybe mull over. Kierkegaard outlines all these different forms of despair: unconsciousness, weakness, defiance, the imbalances. Which form, or maybe which aspect of despair, seems most prevalent, most insidious perhaps in our world today? And does his cure, that leap of faith, grounding the self in God, does that still resonate? Does it still offer a relevant way to understand, maybe even address, the core existential challenges we face now? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.